And he let people know that he was somebody who was going somewhere, and that once he set his mind to something, he was almost certain to accomplish it.
Jackson attended the local dancing school so frequently, he was asked to manage Salisbury's annual Christmas ball.
He invited all the proper young ladies and gentlemen to come, and as a joke, he invited the town's notorious prostitutes, thinking they would never come, understanding that it was a dance for the gentry. And they showed up in all their finery, to the astonishment, if not the anger and outrage, of the more genteel individuals at the dance, and they were really angry. Jackson could do outrageous things from time to time.
Jackson's boisterous personality began to reveal itself in other ways as well.
He fell in with a crowd of young guys about his own age who decided the most exciting thing they could do was carouse at every opportunity. In one case, they got drunk and they somehow or other decided that they were going to build a fire, and the fire eventually got bigger and they were going to throw more things in the fire, and they ultimately almost burned down the tavern where they were. Later on, after Jackson became famous, there were a whole lot of people who said, Jackson? Andrew Jackson? That guy we knew back then? It utterly boggled their minds to think that anything good had come from that young guy.
In 1788, Jackson headed west to Tennessee, not yet a state, but a territory. He settled in Nashville, where, within a year, a Superior Court judge made 21-year-old Jackson a prosecutor, a prestigious appointment that did not go over well with many of his more experienced peers, including a lawyer named Waitstill Avery.
He probably said, "You don't really know the law," and I would suspect that might be true. Jackson took offense, and so he challenged him to a duel.
When Jackson was a very young boy, just prior to his mother's passing away, one of the things she told him was, don't tell lies and don't accept slanders, but settle those problems yourself, by which she meant, don't sue for slander, call them out on the dueling field.
Jackson was somebody who often acted as though he had something to prove. And he did. I mean, what he had to prove was that he was worthy of people's respect, that folks ought to pay attention to him. And dueling, especially on that part of the frontier, was a way somebody earned respect.
It was the first duel of Jackson's life. He was not a good shot, and he knew it. But since he had made the challenge, he had to go through with it. To save his own honor, Avery could not back down. Both aimed and fired, straight up into the air. Without anyone's knowledge, the men had privately agreed beforehand to avoid direct shots. It was a first sign that Jackson could control his temper. The young hellion was beginning to mature.
Whether or not it ultimately led to the exchange of gunfire, the real duel itself, it let people know that Jackson, Andrew Jackson, this young guy, wasn't somebody to be trifled with.
In Nashville, Tennessee, Andrew Jackson felt at home. He lived at a boarding house owned by Rachel Stockley Donaldson, widow of one of Nashville's founders.
It worked well for the Donaldsons in Nashville at that time, which was on the edge of Indian country, which is under constant threat of Indian attack. Every male body that you had, every person who could heft a gun, gave you a little bit more sense of security.
Jackson became very fond of his landlord's daughter, Rachel Donaldson Robards. She was attractive, well-educated, and, unlike most women at the time, openly spoke her mind. There was only one problem.
She was already married to a man by the name of Louis Robards, who was a very suspicious type and who really believed the worst about his wife. His relationship with her was so bad that it was abusive. I don't know that she was physically abused, and probably not, but the mental abuse, I'm convinced, was excessive.
Rachel had determined that she had probably married the wrong man. But in the context of that day, even if you realize you married the wrong man, you had to stay with that man for the rest of your life because there was no way out.
By 1790, Rachel had moved to the Spanish-controlled territory of Natchez, Mississippi, without her husband. Jackson was a frequent visitor. The next year, the couple claimed they married in Natchez, believing that Rachel's husband had divorced her.
What they resorted to was self-divorce, something that was not uncommon among the Scotch-Irish in Scotland, not uncommon on the American frontier.
Andrew and Rachel's decision to marry would create controversy throughout their married life.
Who married them? We don't know. There is absolutely no evidence. Could it have been a migrant preacher of some kind? Sure. But they were in Spanish territory, and only marriages conducted by a Catholic priest were legitimate.
The Jacksons returned to Nashville and bought a small plantation with 15 slaves. But 2 years later, in 1793, they learned that Rachel's first husband had not divorced her, and he was now charging Rachel with adultery. Only then did a divorce become final. In January 1794, Andrew and Rachel were wed in a second, more legal ceremony in Tennessee. Years later, Jackson's political advisors would spin what happened as accidental bigamy. Jackson's life as a plantation owner wouldn't last long. In 1796, at age 29, he was appointed Tennessee's first member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He soon made his presence known when he voted against a resolution of thanks to George Washington.
He voted against it because George Washington had accepted the Jay Treaty, a treaty with Great Britain that humiliated this country. Washington was more and more seen as the great hero, which he was, of this nation, and should be revered. To have said and done anything against him made you something like a traitor to the country. But Jackson acted out of his own conviction.
He was suspicious of the effete Easterner. He was suspicious of the devious congressman. He considered himself the antithesis of that. They were complicated. He was simple.
After 1 year in the House and another in the Senate, Jackson quit and returned to Nashville.
Jackson discovered that his wasn't what you could call a legislative personality. To succeed in a legislature, you have to, well, sort of play well with other children, as the kindergarten teachers say.
He had a lifelong antipathy toward professional politicians, even though he was one.
And he benefited from them. At the age of 31, Jackson was appointed to another job, this time as circuit judge in Tennessee's Superior Court.
As a judge, he was very effective. You knew, by God, what he meant and what he wanted you to do, and you did it.
Sometimes that meant taking the law into his own hands. Like the time he went after a man who had resisted arrest by the local sheriff.
People came to him and they said, "Why did you do that?" And this man said, "I looked at Jackson and there was shoot in his eyes. And there wasn't shoot in the eyes of any of those other men. And so I said to myself, Hoss, you better drop your weapons." And I did.
Jackson had achieved a position in life far beyond his expectations. As years passed, he increasingly gained the respect of the people of Tennessee. While still a judge, Jackson participated in his first election and won the part-time job as Major General of Tennessee's volunteer militia.